안녕하십니까. 오늘 세계경제연구원 S&P 글로벌 조찬포럼에 오신 여러분 환영합니다. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the IGE S&P Global Breakfast Forum. 오늘 조찬 행사는 먼저 세계경제연구원 전광우 이사장님의 간단한 인사 말씀으로 시작을 해서 조찬 식사가 제공된 이후에 발표가 진행될 예정입니다. To give you a rundown of today's proceedings, we will begin with short opening remarks from Chairman 전광우 of IGE, after which breakfast will be served, and we will dive into the presentations after we've all had some breakfast. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming with a big hand Chairman 전광우 of IGE. 큰 박수 부탁드립니다.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is very exciting day, and actually, because this is very first breakfast forum in about 3 years, because of the COVID restrictions that have been imposed for our events. So, for the last 3 years, the flagship program we have over a long period of time, this breakfast forum, has been carried out in the form of a webinar, without having in-person contacts, because of we are not in a position to serve you breakfast during those times. Even though for last 3 days, we did continue our international conferences in-house, in person, sometimes hybrid form, much bigger scale. We continued that. Fortunately, we were able to serve you with decent lunch. But as far as breakfast goes, this is, if I'm not mistaken, a first time in 3 years. So I'm so very delighted to have you all here. Another reason why I'm so very happy and excited for today's event is because of this the joint organization nature of this particular event. This is not just IGE's a forum. It is done, prepared, and presented in cooperation with globally respected rating agency, Standard & Poor's. The representatives from S&P are here in person, not just one. We will have 4 speakers in their respective field this morning. I'm so very happy that we are able to have them for our event. I'm sure they are very busy with also ADB event in Songdo. What I'd like to thank Mr. Jamin Kwon Jamin, the country head, Korea country head of S&P, and along with other 4 distinguished speakers who I will introduce later on. Today the topic is, as you know, not just Korea, the Asia Pacific, and for that matter, global economic challenges. The headwinds are pretty strong. We feel that we need a better crystal ball through which we can see better what's really going on down the road. The interesting point that I may like to share with you is that one of the recent Economist, the weekly magazine from the United Kingdom, has an interesting article saying that the global economy today is a bit like Mona Lisa's smile, because you don't know exactly what that smile means. On the one hand, it's maybe a good sign for the economy, but on the other, some feel that if you go there and see the picture, the face of Mona Lisa. Sometimes you feel like that she looks rather sad, not really smile. The key point of that article was that it is extremely uncertain time to see the future trajectory of global economy, and for that reason, we need the experts from S&P to help us better understand what's really going on in Asia Pacific and Korean market in the coming months and years. Okay, with that, the way we would like to proceed is that after this, we'd like to have a breakfast, and starting at around 8 o'clock, we'll have 4 presentations for you, followed by about 10-20 minutes of Q&A session. Once again, I would like to thank all of you, and especially our invited speakers from Standard & Poor's. Would you like to say hi, Mr. Kwon? Yeah. Just very quickly. Okay, here, please.
제가 인사 말씀 따로 안 드린다고는 말씀드렸는데 일단 한국말로 하겠습니다. 제가 준비를 안 해서. 안녕하십니까, 저 S&P 한국 대표 권재민입니다. 오늘 뭐 이렇게 좋은 행사에 초대해 주신 정강우 의장님 비롯해서 세계경제연구원 께 감사드립니다. 지금 이제 뭐 여러 가지 언설티티 때문에 신문에 뭐 이자율 오른다 내린다 뭐 많이 부동산 PF도 어렵다 뭐 이런 얘기가 이제 많이 나오고 있는데 한국도 불확실하지만 이제 세계적으로 또 지오폴리티컬리도 불확실한 상황입니다. 저희 S&P는 저희도 이제 사실 1,500명 이상의 애널리스트가 전 세계적으로 아주 데일리 베이스로 투자가들과 또한 기업들과 계속 인터랙션을 하면서 정보를 모으고 분석을 하고 있지만 사실 저희도 혼란스러운 건 마찬가지긴 합니다. 그렇지만 저희가 사실은 뭐 크리스탈 볼을 가진 건 아니고요. 저희가 이제 150년의 역사 동안에 과거의 어떤 히스토리컬 트랙 레코드나 또 현재의 어떤 분석 방법론을 통해서 저희가 생각하는 가정하에 이렇게 진행될 확률이 높다. 이렇게 됐을 때는 크레딧 환경이 이렇게 될 것이다. 라는 뷰를 이제 저희가 기다리지 않고 저희가 좀 빨리 선도적으로 말씀드리는 게 저희의 이제 이럴 때 불확실성이 많을 때 역할이라고 생각을 하고요. 또 그런 딱 시점에서 이런 좋은 자리를 마련해 주셔서 저희가 뭐 가장 저희 애널리스트 중에서는 가장 시니어 프로파일 가진 사람들 이번에 한국에 이제 데리고 왔고요. 그래서 여러분들께 S&P 뷰를 들려드릴 수 있게 된 것을 저희는 뭐 영광으로 생각하고 또 감사하게 생각합니다. 오늘 아침에 부지런히 아침에 나오셨는데 아침 시간 헛되이 보내지 않게 저희 좋은 의견을 많이 나눠드리도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.
네, 다시 한번 저희 개회사를 해주신 세계경제연구원 전광우 이사장님과 그리고 권재민 S&P 한국 대표님께 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. Thank you once again for helping us kick off today's event with those opening remarks. And your breakfast will soon be served, so wait just one moment. 곧 조찬 식사가 제공될 예정이오니 잠시만 기다려주시면 감사하겠습니다. 그리고 발표가 시작된 이후에는 통역 서비스가 필요하신 분들께서는 통역 수신기를 1번은 한국어, 2번은 영어로 맞춰서 들어주시면 되겠습니다. For those of you who need interpretation services, please turn to channel 1 for Korean and 2 for English on your receivers. Thank you very much.
I hope you had a good breakfast. As I told you in the beginning, we have 4 speakers, not just one, meaning that for next less than 1 hour, we have a pretty busy schedule. We'll have 4 separate presentations, followed by Q&As. Hopefully, well, we could have good questions from the floor as well. To save time, let's get started. The first speaker today is Mr. Louis Kush. He's on my way right. He's Chief Economist, Asia Pacific at S&P Global Ratings. He will talk about Korean economic outlook in the middle of global headwinds. So, would you start, Louis? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Jun. So I'll be talking for about 10 minutes about the global economic outlook, APAC region, and also, of course,
Could you get a little closer? Yeah.
and also, of course, try to zoom in a bit on our views on South Korea. So I have some slides as well, which I'm just going to check. Yeah, how they work. So this is my outline. As I mentioned, global, China, and the rest of APAC. So to start with the global situation, our economic forecasts for both, in terms of economic growth, for both the US and Europe are quite moderate. We don't expect a lot of growth this year. We also, so far, do not expect very large contractions. Like so far, the news has been a little bit positive on both the US and European side in terms of how resilient these economies are to things like higher interest rates and inflation. So we're having relatively similar situations on both sides. Inflation is not yet out of the picture. Interest rates remain quite elevated, but there is a decent amount of resilience that prevents these economies from starting to decline significantly, but very little growth. The story in both places is really about inflation, and almost every day we read about how the prospects look for what we think the US Fed will do. And for instance, when recently we had the financial turmoil, and we actually still have it in some segments of the US banking sector. And then the question always is, will that lead the US Fed to start to lower its interest rates in order to, ease financial conditions and make life easier for the financial sector? In our view, that is not going to happen. The Fed is continuing to work on two pillars. Use their financial instruments, like the liquidity instruments that they can use to inject more money into the system to deal with the financial turbulence, while they continue to use their interest rate policy to fight inflation. And inflation is quite serious. Inflation in the US has been more sticky than people expected. It actually, if you forget about oil and energy prices, but zoom in on that very domestic dynamics between firms passing on price increases, workers demanding higher wages, that core inflation dynamic is actually still quite powerful as we look at it in the first months of this year. And so that's a picture that, in our view, still looks quite serious, and that is why we don't think the US Fed will be in a position to lower its policy rate even any time this year. So we only expect them to start lowering this interest rate early next year. And as you can see, the picture in Europe, in our view, is not that much different. We still expect further increases, and we don't expect a quick reduction on the European side either. And that matters because these global interest rates are having their effect also in our part of the world over here in Asia. Moving to China, the Chinese economy is undergoing a quite nice recovery, but that is a recovery from a really weak 2022. As you know, 2022 in China was very weak because of all the COVID restrictions. People could hardly leave their house, they didn't spend, they didn't travel, so a lot of pent-up demand, and quite a bit of that pent-up demand is now being unleashed, and you can see it on the streets here in Seoul as well. People are starting to travel again, are starting to spend again. and that consumption and services part of the economy is indeed that part that we see growing the fastest. The service sector is by far growing faster than industry. Consumption is growing faster than investment at the moment. That is what we expected, and that is what we will continue to expect for the rest of this year. Having said that, the housing market has started to bottom out. As you know, the housing market in China was affected by a very strict policy onto property developers starting in 2021 for much of 2022. At the end of 2022, the government made a U-turn. They changed. They felt that the economic and financial impact of this restriction is too much, and we're going to ease up. They have started to ease up. There is a bottoming out in our view. However, we do not expect the property sector to undergo the kind of very sharp recovery that we have often seen in the past in China. And so this is something that we follow. If the housing sector continues to at least bottom out and improve somewhat, which is what the trend is, then that will be helpful to broaden and sustain the recovery in China. But we have to admit that the picture so far is not bad, but some of the very recent data has not been very good. The April manufacturing PMI was disappointing, and also some of the high frequency, very timely housing sales data was not very good. And so we need to see how this evolves. We expect 5.5% growth, GDP growth in China this year. That is a little bit faster than our estimate for trend growth, like potential GDP growth, the kind of growth that you can have before you start to see overheating. So China, in our view, is undergoing a cyclical recovery, and next year we expect around 5% growth, a little bit more towards a steady state path. So far so good in China. We have not yet seen a huge amount of impact of the Chinese recovery on the rest of the world, including in South Korea. As you know, South Korea's exports to China are still not very strong. That is, and you can see on the right-hand side, if you look at China's overall imports, if you correct for prices and if you correct for seasonal factors and look at how things are moving month on month, then they have started to improve, but we haven't yet really felt that very much outside of China. We're still waiting for that. I mentioned China, and I mentioned before the West. For basically, if China is accelerating and the West is decelerating, if you zoom in on South Korea in this chart, you see that the importance of these two markets, the West and China, for South Korea in terms of where the final demand for your exports are coming from, that importance for South Korea is broadly equal. That means that the improvement in economic conditions in China are really quite important also for South Korea, and that they can by and large offset the weakening that we have in the West. But as I mentioned, we still need to start to see that, because in the first months of the year, that improvement in China hasn't yet had a lot of spillover impact. Talking about growth, our view on the region as a whole, the APAC region, is that growth will diminish this year compared to what it was last year. Last year was particularly good, especially because in many of the economies, the benefit, the domestic post-COVID recovery was still yielding benefits. That is mitigating, of course. Also, we have that cooling in the West, and we have higher interest rates. So, for instance, looking at South Korea, which of course is an economy that is quite sensitive to the global picture, and where interest rates have had their impact, especially on the housing market, we expect around 1.1% growth this year, GDP growth. As you know, the first quarter data was not too bad, was better than the fourth quarter of last year, broadly in line with what we had expected. So we are at the moment still comfortable with this forecast for lower growth. But I think one point that I would want to make about our general forecast for the APAC region is that growth is lower than it is in the West, growth is lower than what it is in 2022, but underlying economic growth in APAC is quite a bit higher than in the West, and that is also reflected in that forecast that even in a weak year like 2023, we still have many economies growing quite significantly, 3%, 4%, 5%. Not South Korea, unfortunately, but several others. Moving to the inflation picture in the region, I mentioned the US, and you can see that it's not really light, it's ocean blue according to my computer. That ocean blue line on the left-hand side is what I mentioned, like core prices in the US. How are they moving month on month? It doesn't look good, right? In terms of that challenge that the Fed has. Many Asian economies, especially the larger ones, do not have such a serious inflation problem as the US has, as you can see on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. But there are a few that do. Australia, the Philippines. I would say South Korea is a little bit in the middle. You are still, in my view, facing inflation pressures that perhaps are sometimes not. I think sometimes our view on the outlook for inflation in South Korea is not as sanguine as it is in according to some other economists. So we expect that it will take a little bit more time than the Bank of Korea thinks before inflation will be closer to its target, and that is also why we don't think that there is going to be a lot of room for the policy rate in South Korea to come down this year. A little bit same story as in the US, where if you look at that momentum of core, we just yesterday I think had inflation data coming out for South Korea. If you look at that, how are prices, core prices, so excluding food and energy, these core prices, how are they moving month on month? That there is still quite a bit of inflation momentum in South Korea, and that is why we think, that's one of the reasons why we think there's not a lot of space to lower interest rates anytime soon, although we do expect them to come down next year. I think I have come to the end of my part of the presentation because these are more longer term issues, and maybe just one very last thing. I think, as you know much better than me, the South Korean economy has done tremendously well, is an advanced economy. It is of course also an economy that shares some of the headwinds that other advanced economies are going through in terms of growth, not anymore being 3%, 4%, 5%. Our outlook on South Korean growth in that longer term perspective, looking at potential output growth, is around 2%, say, if you look at it up until 2030. That's still quite decent, but that's something just that we have to live with. So I'm going to close it over here and hand it back to Dr. Jun.
Okay. Thank you, Louis, for your excellent presentation. Essentially, what we are hearing is that we should expect slow growth this year, but better next year. Slow, but at the same time, is not as bad as to stumble. So no hard landing crash sort of scenario was not what he has in mind. Certainly we'll have questions to follow, and also he did make important point on interest rate prospect. Given the sticky core inflation, we may not expect a rate decline this year, perhaps more likely next year. That's the kind of key message that I hear. We'll follow up on a question later on. We'll first have 4 presentations. Now, Mr. Tan Kim Heng-tan, is a senior director in charge of sovereign and international public finance ratings, Asia Pacific sovereign risk. He's talking about Asia Pacific sovereign risk outlook.
Okay,
Mr.
thanks
Tan,
very much.
Thank you.
After every crisis, the one thing that is almost certain to happen is, of course, higher government debt, which is why today we are talking about the US debt ceiling. We're talking about the Eurozone trying to return back to some kind of fiscal rules again. But the fact is, the COVID crisis actually caused the most balance sheet damage in Asia. If you look at this chart, the change in net government debt has been the largest among some of the countries that we see as major economies in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, despite that, we have all stable outlook on all of our sovereigns that we rate in Asia-Pacific. Now, I have to caveat that when you have a CCC plus rating like Pakistan, a stable outlook doesn't really mean stable. CCC plus just means that you're very likely to go into default anytime. But apart from Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which is in default already, the other ratings all have stable outlook and reasonable rating levels, and therefore, the conclusion you can draw from that is that we are unlikely, or at least S&P doesn't believe that there will be a financial crisis in any of these countries anytime in the near future. And over the next few slides, I'll just highlight quickly go over some of the key reasons why we don't believe that is so. Now, firstly, apart from Japan, most Asia-Pacific region, and Sri Lanka, most of Asia-Pacific sovereigns do not have very high sovereign debt. As you can see in this chart, it is relatively well dispersed, so there are some with more debt, some with less debt, but they are not concentrated at the high end as we saw in the previous slide. Now, the second thing is, even though interest rates have gone up, as in most other places in the world, the fact is interest rates have not gone up by as much as elsewhere. So the debt burden or interest burden of this government debts are not as heavy as elsewhere. Now, the second thing to note from this chart is also that the average interest rate in the Asia-Pacific region is actually much lower than in some other emerging market regions. So that's another reason why we are not too worried about the debt burden arising from higher government debt. Now, thirdly, the Asia-Pacific region has some major economies where the domestic savings rates are very high, as reflected in the current account balances, which usually are in surplus or in small deficit. Secondly, many of them have low external debt, and in many places, external creditors. And therefore, the conclusion we draw from that is that they are mainly domestically focused as far as their financing is concerned, and therefore the exchange rate risk associated with government debt also is less. Now, all this just means that for most governments in this region, the interest burden of debt is actually not that high, as you can see. In most of our major economies, the interest paid by most governments are actually less than 20-30%. Whereas in places where you're more likely to see financial crisis or economic distress is where the debt levels are, the interest burden is much higher, as you can see in Pakistan and Sri Lanka, which of course have the lowest ratings that we have right now. Now, one thing to note is that the heaviest indebted government in the region, Japan, actually is also facing some transition at this point. But given that we are mostly focused on EM today, I think we'll just skip over that. Now, another reason for our optimism is that despite all the negative developments that we have seen in the global economy, we still believe that Asia-Pacific is where growth will be in the future. And the IMF, for instance, has projected that the emerging and developing Asia region will grow by 4.8% over the next few years, which is the highest in terms of all the regions that they have. So that obviously is another support for the government's revenue, and therefore is debt sustaining capacity. This one is more about manufacturing, which despite all the concerns about nearshoring, friendshoring, moving to Mexico and elsewhere, the fact is we believe that in the near future at least, manufacturing remains heavily centered into the Asia-Pacific region, which for whatever reason has some stabilizing effect, both for economic growth reasons as well as geopolitical reasons. Now, focus on Korea. Now, the government's own debt level and the government's deficit has been relatively healthy over the COVID crisis that we saw over the past few years. Now, the one thing that has happened, however, is that off balance sheet, the liabilities of public enterprises has been coming up again. Now, this is not unusual because if you look at this chart on the left, from 2010 to 2013, the debt levels of public enterprises actually went up. Again, this was the period just after the global financial crisis and in the midst of the Eurozone crisis. And we saw that the government was unwilling to allow some of the tariffs charged by some of the NFPs or financial enterprises, non-financial enterprises to rise, which is resulted in the accumulation of debt. Now, having the experience of that and seeing that debt levels are coming back again at these companies, we should have some optimism that once things stabilize, they will come back down again. And anyway, compared to the period in 2013, the liabilities of these enterprises are already lower. Household debt is, of course, another issue. Korea, according to the BIS, has the third highest in the world. But of course, when you do country-to-country comparison of this kind of statistics, it is not very meaningful sometimes because of different national definitions. But the fact is, it is true that household debt is high in Korea by any means. And this, of course, has been a problem that we've been highlighting for many years. And actually, the thing is, apart from a high level of debt, the debt servicing ratio has also been deteriorating. So this is clearly one issue of concern. Now, our view is that it is unlikely to cause a financial crisis or economic distress in Korea directly, but in a bad scenario, when other shocks hit the Korean economy, it could worsen the problem. And in the meantime, if higher interest rates were to take hold, then households will have less spending power because they have to pay more in terms of their debts. Now, related to the household debt is, of course, the housing prices, and we have seen very large increases and now seemingly large decline in the house price, which is of concern. However, apart from the household debt angle, there's also the activity level. In that regard, we are a bit comforted by the fact that inventories right now seem to be highest in a few places where prices are not high. And therefore, hopefully, the financial commitments of the real estate developers and the related financial burden needed to resolve some of these excess inventory levels will not be way too much on the bank's balance sheet and the economy as well. So for that, all that, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is our outlook for the Korean ratings is generally stable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Tan, for your excellent and candid analysis of the situation in Asia and Korea as well. As we all know, household debt servicing ratio has deteriorated. That continues. But by and large, his point was that the rating outlook is pretty much stable as far as he can see at the moment. Certainly, we will follow up with more questions later on. Now, Christopher Lee is our next speaker. He's head of corporate ratings, Asia Pacific S&P Global Ratings. He's talking about Asia Pacific corporate outlook. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jun. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'll take you through some slides about our view on Asia Pacific corporates. Very high-level view about defaults, refinancing, and financial performance. My colleague Jun Hong specializes in Korean corporates. He will explain in more detail our views about the Korean corporate rating trends. So, if I could just summarize our view about APAC corporate trends in one sentence, it would be it's stabilizing. Last year was a very tough year for defaults. Many companies fell into distress, many defaulted, and many are now going through a debt restructuring or, in some unfortunate cases, a liquidation process. Most of the defaults are focused in China, mainly one sector, property developers. We can come back to that later and explain why there's a particular concentration of the defaults in Chinese property sector. But property generally last year was a difficult year for developers. To some extent, the Southeast Asian developers were also in trouble last year. And we had seen Indonesian developers defaulting by a fairly significant number. And also in Vietnam, a very small and underdeveloped market, we also have seen developers defaulting. And as I understand it, in Korea, you also have a few cases. So it is, I won't say systemic, but probably a direct result of shocks. The shocks due to interest rate, very rapid interest rate rises in the United States and causing investors losing confidence and restricting capital access in the offshore market. So that's the context that we are looking at when we think about 23 defaults and also credit trends. So since 22, since the beginning of this year, we're looking at a much more improved situations. So on the left-hand side of the chart, you can see the number of rating downgrades versus upgrade has significantly reduced. We are now looking at an even ratio between upgrades and downgrades. Compared to 22, we saw a big spike. And also during COVID, the early phase of COVID, we saw a big spike in Q1 and Q2 of 2020. Another perspective is to look at the ratings outlook, upgrades and downgrades, or changes. And on the right-hand side chart, you can also see since 2020, the rating outlook changes have significantly reduced to about currently an even ratio. So overall, we have a couple factors that are driving this improvement. A big one is China changing its policy on COVID last year, the reopening of the economy. Second is the ability of many of the corporates to access domestic capital markets and bank loans for funding and also for refinancing. And finally, a bit of capital discipline that has set in for a lot of the corporates in times of uncertainty, allowing them to preserve capital and also cash flows. So what that means for Asian corporates is that we're now seeing a divergence in default rates compared to other regions, especially in the US. So on the left-hand chart, you see the global default rates are now ticking up. In 21, it was 66 defaults globally. In 22, it was 69. In the first quarter, we see 33. And that's a significant uptick from 9 the same period a year ago. You see the same trend going the other way for APAC, especially in Q1 of this year. Last year, we had 3 for Q1, and in the first quarter of this year, there was no defaults at all. And if you look at the monthly trend, the monthly stats, which is much more indicative of this trend, on the right-hand side, the 12-month defaults and rapid transitions stats. In the case of rapid transitions, we define this as any rating actions with 2 notches of movement. So in the last couple of months, we've basically seen none in terms of defaults and also rapid transitions in our statistics. So there's a diverging trend. Asia is doing a much better shape, is in a much better shape when it comes to credit trends and also defaults, whereas in the global, led by the US, it's going the other way. So what are some of the companies that are vulnerable in Asia? I would say we are not completely out of the woods when we think about distress situations or potential defaults. Some developers in China are still on the brink, but the number that are in distress or near distress are significantly smaller in numbers than a year ago. The risk now is about how sustainable the capital structure of these developers are, as opposed to the liquidity. We have seen the Chinese government taking very forceful actions, especially in the fourth quarter of 2022, to stabilize the funding and the liquidity and the access to bank loans and also capital markets by property developers in the domestic market. That has, in our view, set a floor for the sector and create the conditions for a recovery in the sector that is now materializing. But we think that this is a long, long road. It's a long process for recovery. We don't think it's a V-shape, as Louis had mentioned. It's more likely to be an L-shaped recovery with a very prolonged improvement path. I will say one thing about elevated funding costs, because this is very relevant point for our analysis. If you read the newspapers, everyone is worried about refinancing because interest rates are going up very quickly. And investors are worried about defaults. We saw periods of markets being in a very volatile situation where essentially you're not able to access dollar funding. This chart will show you why a lot of Asian corporates have not been impacted by the high interest rate as much as people thought. If you look at the onshore, this is China. This is onshore funding, AAA rated, the blue line versus the offshore funding cost, a yield to maturity. The difference is pretty stark, 300 basis points, and it has compressed since the Q4 last year. So that shows you the ability to access domestic funding is one of the most important factors that have prevented more defaults than we have seen. So also in the refinancing, corporate refinancing volume, we saw a really nice pickup in terms of loans to corporates, which suggested that instead of relying on offshore funding, corporates have turned to onshore and tapping the bank loans. So this has all come back, this all comes back to policy support from the Chinese government to ensure that corporates get the funding that they need. Not from the offshore market, which is volatile, but from the onshore market. And finally, I want to have a quick comment, make a quick comment about the cost pressure for corporates. The sectors that are most exposed to cost pressure are those that have fairly volatile business, competitive sectors, and relatively weaker margins. And these are transportation, manufacturing, and also merchant power. I think, Luke, it was Kim-Ing that mentioned about utilities in Korea. I mean, certainly across APAC, the ability to utilities to pass on cost quickly and fully to end users is very uneven. So those are the three sectors that are vulnerable to cost pressures, and some are still battling the issue of higher costs. But it's an uneven picture. Now with the economy growing, I think some of these issues will slowly go away. So I would just end my presentation there and pass it back to Mr. Zhu.
Okay, thank you very much. For credit and rating outlook side, broadly situation has appears to have improved, especially in Asia compared to other parts, including United States. But he did mention caution that we are not completely out of the woods yet. So with that caveat, we hope to come back with some questions later on. Okay, so last but not least, we have Mr. Junhong Park Junhong, Director of Corporate Ratings, Asia Pacific, S&P Global Ratings. He will discuss Korean corporates caught in global crosswinds. I like this the title of this
Thank you for
speech.
having me,
Yeah.
Mr. John. 저는 한국말로 발표를 하도록 하겠습니다. 지금 뭐 시간이 많지는 않은데 짧게 지금 한국 기업들이 신용도 측면에서 어떤 흐름을 보이는지랑 그리고 좀 주요 섹터별로 어떻게 좀 흐름이 달라지는지 이런 것들을 설명을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 예, 먼저 전체적으로 지금 한국 기업들의 신용도 흐름을 보면은 지금 올해 왼쪽에 있는 차트 오른쪽을 보시면 이 최근에 조금 더 부정적인 방향의 레이팅 액션이 많은 그런 추세입니다. 그래서 이게 작년 하반기부터 시작해가지고 지금 올해 지금 뭐 한 1분기 지나는 시점에서 봤을 때에는 좀 더 하방 압력을 받는 그런 한국 기업들이 많이 있고요. 뭐 대표적인 기업으로는 뭐 SK 하이닉스라든지 뭐 저희 뭐 지금 S-오일이나 그리고 LG전자 이런 회사들 그리고 또 SK 이노베이션 그룹 이런 쪽이 좀 부정적인 방향의 레이팅 액션이 있었고요. 그런 이유들에 대해서는 조금 뒤에 설명을 드리겠습니다. 그래서 이 차트에서는 지금 전체적으로 한국 100대 기업의 그런 재무지표, 파이낸셜 매트릭스가 어떤 흐름을 보이는지를 보여주는데 일단 왼쪽을 보시면 이 파란색 바로 된 게 영업이익 흐름이에요. 그래서 분기별로 영업이익 흐름을 보시면 최근에 지금 최근 몇 분기 사이에 급격하게 하락하는 모습을 보이는 걸 확인하실 수 있습니다. 그래서 작년 2분기까지, 작년 상반기까지는 뭐 영업 흐름이 상당히 견조했는데 3분기에 꺾이기 시작했고요. 그리고 4분기에는 아주 많이 떨어졌죠. 4분기에는 이게 이제 포함된 게 뭐 하이닉스 같은 회사들 영업 적자를 낸 부분, 그다음에 한전도 적자를 많이 냈고요. 그리고 이제 그런 부분들이 여기에 작용을 하고 있었고 지금 1분기 숫자는 지금 나오고 있는데요. 아마도 1분기도 4분기 못지않게 안 좋을 것 같습니다. 지금 삼성전자도 많이 꺾였고 그래서 그런 흐름은 지금도 지속이 되고 있다. 그리고 오른쪽을 보시면 주요 산업별로 보시면은 이것도 이제 영업 이익의 흐름을 산업별로 이렇게 저희가 요약을 해놓은 건데 가장 좀 눈에 띄는 거는 맨 위에 있는 테크놀로지 섹터. 여기에 이제 그런 반도체라든지 뭐 디스플레이 패널 그리고 이제 가전 이런 것들이 포함되어 있는데요. 이 부분이 눈에 띄게 꺾이고 있습니다. 그래서 지금 뭐 작년 하반기, 3분기, 4분기 그리고 올해 1분기에 지금 실적 발표 나오는 것들 확인해 보시면 이 트렌드가 지금 계속되고 있고 상당히 하방 압력이 크다 이렇게 말씀을 드릴 수 있겠습니다. 그리고 또 어려운 섹터로는 맨 아래쪽에 있는 유틸리티 여기에는 뭐 한전이나 가스공사 같은 이런 공기업들이 포함이 되어 있는데요. 특히 한전이 적자가 워낙 많이 나고 있고요. 그래서 이 부분은 구조적인 이슈가 있어서 이것도 조금 회복하기 쉽지는 않아 보이는 그런 상황입니다. 하지만 또 여기서 보면 눈에 띄는 거는 상대적으로 견조한 섹터는 여기 오토 앤 오토 파트 그래서 자동차 관련한 쪽은 상당히 좀 리질리언트한 모습을 보이고 있습니다. 그것도 제가 시간이 되면 조금 더 설명을 드리겠습니다. 그래서 전체적으로 한국 기업의 지금 저희가 보는 지표 중에서 눈에 띄는 거는 재고 자산입니다. 그래서 인벤토리가 상당히 좀 많이 올라온 상황이고요. 그래서 지금 왼쪽 차트에서 보시면 작년 하반기 뭐 이렇게 인벤토리가 올라가는 상황이고 특히 반도체 회사 오른쪽을 보시면 이 하이닉스나 삼성전자의 인벤토리 흐름은 지금 올해 1분기 실적이 지난주에 나왔는데요. 여전히 상승하는 추세입니다. 그래서 아직 이 재고 조정 문제가 해소가 되지 않은 것 같고요. 이게 더 뭐 좀 시간이 걸릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 그래서 이런 부분은 좀 실적의 압박 요인으로 계속 작용하고 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 좀 주요 섹터별로 조금 더 살펴보겠습니다. 일단은 좀 가장 어려워 보이는 섹터 그쪽부터 설명드리겠습니다. 가장 먼저 들 수 있는 거는 반도체고요. 일단 반도체 산업이 한국 경제에서 차지하는 비중이 워낙 크기 때문에 이 부분은 뭐 경제 전체적으로도 부담인 것 같습니다. 그래서 왼쪽에서 보실 수 있듯이 이 ASP, Selling Price가 DRAM, NAND 플래시 다 많이 떨어졌고요. 이 부분은 아직까지도 의미 있는 반등을 보이고 있지는 않습니다. 그래서 2분기도 어려운 분기가 될 것 같아요. 그리고 이제 이런 이유로는 또 오른쪽에 보시면 뭐 삼성이나 하이닉스 그리고 마이크론 같은 반도체 메이커들이 그 캐펙스 투자를 상당히 많이 최근에 진행을 했는데 이런 부분들이 수요가 약한 상황이랑 겹쳐가지고 초과 공급 상황을 지금 낳고 있고요. 그래서 지금 좀 가장 좀 어려운 반도체 산업 전체적으로는 시기를 겪고 있는 중이다. 이렇게 말씀을 드릴 수 있겠습니다. 그래서 한국 기업들의 실적을 보시면 여기 왼쪽에 하이닉스에 지금 파란색으로 바로 된 게 영업이익 트렌드인데요. 뭐 지금 최근 분기에 3조 이상 영업 적자를 냈죠. 한 3조 4천억 정도 하이닉스가 영업 적자가 났고, 그리고 이 노란색으로 된 그 바가 차입금 수준입니다. 그래서 지금 2018년부터 시작해가지고 한 지난 4, 5년 사이에 하이닉스의 차입금이 엄청나게 빠른 속도로 증가하는 걸 보실 수 있습니다. 그래서 이런 부분들이 좀 그런 신용도에는 상당한 부담 요인으로 작용하고 있는 그런 상황입니다. 삼성전자 같은 경우에도 오른쪽에 보시면 지금 1분기에 반도체 사업부에서 적자를 냈는데요. 이게 그 찾아보니까 2009년에 적자가 난 다음에 최초로 지금 적자가 난 부분이에요. 삼성전자 반도체 사업 같은 경우에는. 그래서 조금 다운턴이 와도 삼성전자 같은 리딩 플레이어는 적자까지 가지 않았는데 이번에 1분기도 그렇고 아마 2분기에도 회복하기는 쉽지 않을 것 같아요. 그래서 그런 부분을 보면은 지금 전체적으로 이 반도체 산업의 다운 사이클이 상당히 좀 깊다 이렇게 말씀을 드릴 수 있겠습니다. 그리고 또 유사한 좀 어려운 산업으로는 디스플레이 패널도 있는 것 같습니다. 그래서 이제 오른쪽에 보시면 LG 디스플레이의 저게 영업이익 트렌드인데요. 우하향하는 게 되게 눈에 띄죠. 그래서 지금 작년 그 2분기부터 적자를 내기 시작해가지고 지금 올해 1분기에 지난주에 실적 발표가 나왔는데 계속해서 지금 큰 폭의 적자를 기록하고 있습니다. 그래서 여기도 좀 상황은 비슷한데 일단은 전체적으로 수요가 TV라든지 스마트폰이라든지 이런 제품의 수요가 줄어들어서 이런 패널 메이커, 반도체 메이커들이 지금 수요 둔화에 되게 어려움을 겪고 있는 그런 상황이고, 또 공급 측면에서도 과거에 좀 공격적으로 투자했던 부분들이 초과 공급 상황을 낳고 있는 것으로 보입니다. 예, 그리고 이 이제 유틸리티, 한전이랑 코가스 쪽도 조금 말씀을 드리겠는데, 이게 아까도 저희가 논의가 되었지만 전체적으로 이 생산 원가, 발전 원가가 올라가는 부분을 지금 그 셀링 프라이스의 그 가격 전가를 하는데 어려움이 있어서 여러 가지 규제 등의 상황으로 인해서 지금 실적 압박이 상당히 큰 상황이고요. 그래서 지금 왼쪽 보시면은 한전의 그 영업이익도 최근에 뭐 큰 폭의 적자를 지속하고 있습니다. 그리고 그 결과로 이 차입금 자체도 빠르게 올라가는 모습을 보이고 있고, 뭐 코가스도 가스공사도 상황은 뭐 비슷한 그런 상황입니다. 그래서 이제 이런 회사들 그리고 이런 산업들이 대표적으로 좀 어려움을 겪고 있는 그런 산업이라고 말씀드릴 수 있겠고요. 근데 또 한국 경제 전체로 보면은 또 잘하고 있는 산업도 있습니다. 그래서 요까지만 말씀드리고 제가 내용이 더 있는데 시간이 짧으니까 요까지만 좀 말씀을 드리고 마치도록 하겠는데요. 그래서 어느 산업이 잘하느냐 보면은 그 자동차가 가장 눈에 띕니다. 그래서 실제로 보면 지금 이게 왼쪽 차트가 현대 기아차의 영업이익 흐름인데요. 이거 보면은 앞에서 본 거와 다르게 우상향하는 모습을 보이고 있죠. 그래서 지금 뭐 작년 4분기도 좋았고요. 지금 올해 1분기도 좋은데 이게 왜 좋냐면은 사실 판매량 자체도 좀 늘어난 부분이 있지만 판매량보다는 이런 질, 퀄리티가 더 좋아진 부분이 있습니다. 그래서 여기 ASP를 저희가 표시해놨는데 자동차 판매 단가가 올라가고 있고요. 그리고 프로덕트 믹스, 그래서 저 프리미엄 제품의 판매 비중이 높아지고, 그리고 현대차 같은 경우에는 또 전기차 쪽의 대응도 상당히 잘하고 있어서 이런 부분들이 뭐 자동차 산업의 전체적으로 견조한 실적을 끌고 있는 것 같습니다. 그리고 오른쪽에 보면은 재고에 대해서 이제 저희가 재고자산 일수를 표시해놨는데 이 부분도 상당히 중요한 요소입니다. 그래서 반도체라든지 이런 다른 좀 제조업이 재고가 너무 높아져서 부담이 있는 거와 반대로 자동차는 계속해서 재고 수준이 낮습니다. 그래서 이게 이제 수요와 공급이 훨씬 더 이게 밸런스가 맞다는 얘기예요. 그래서 공급 쪽에서도 좀 차질이 있어서 생산을 많이 못했고 수요는 꾸준히 있으면서 훨씬 더 이런 기업체들이 훨씬 영업하기 좋은 환경이 조성되었다라고 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 예. 그리고 이제 또 하나는 이제 좀 긍정적인 측면에서는 이게 이제 코로나 기간에 어떤 억눌렸던 어려움을 겪었던 그런 산업들이 좀 회복하는 모습을 보이는 게 있는데요. 그래서 이게 지금 왼쪽에는 저희가 인천공항공사도 레이팅을 하는데, 그래서 공항의 트래픽이 보시면은 작년 한 이제 3분기, 4분기 정도에서 이렇게 리바운드하는 모습을 보이고 있고, 그래서 이런 부분들이, 그리고 또 그 코로나 상황에서 이런 뭐 사용료 감면이라든지 여러 가지 정책적인 지원을 해줬던 부분들이 사라지면서 뭐 이런 공기업이라든지 아니면 뭐 항공, 뭐 여행 관련한 산업들은 올해 뭐 본격적으로 회복되는 모습을 보일 것 같습니다. 그래서 뭐 전체적으로 말씀을 드리면 여기는 이제 뒤쪽은 그냥 저희가 생략하도록 하겠습니다. 시간이 별로 없기 때문에. 그래서 전체적으로 말씀을 드리면 이게 뭐 어려운 섹터들이 눈에 띄긴 합니다. 지금 상황에서는. 그렇지만 신용도 관점에서도 그래서 좀 하향 조정이 예상되는 그런 기업이나 산업들도 있지만 또 상대적으로 견조하게 하는 섹터도 있고, 그다음에 코로나 이후에 회복될 수 있는 그런 섹터도 있기 때문에 뭐 전체적으로는 약간의 하방 압력을 가지고 있지만 밸런스드 돼 있다. 이 정도 톤에서 한국 기업의 아웃룩을 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
예, 감사합니다. May I speak in Korean as well? Yes, we have simultaneous translation support for you, but perhaps to speed up our conversation, if you want, you could speak in Korean as well. Okay, Ambassador. Okay.
Does it work? I hope so. My name is Ho Young-an. I used to be Korea's foreign service officer, and about half of it I spent on economic issues. So first of all, 4 top economists from SP, welcome to Korea. And I was listening to you, and there was one word which came up in my mind, which is intellectual feast. What a feast it was. So Luis, you talked about macroeconomics, and Tan talked about sovereign issues, and Lee and then Park, you talked about corporate issues, and then that in fact is the reason why I said to myself, what a feast, intellectual feast. And having said that, there was one common denominator underlying 4 presentations, which was inflation and interest rate. So I was wondering if I could raise a kind of Econ 101 kind of question to Louis, which is, well, from your presentation, it was quite clear to me that inflation is far higher in the United States, and then relatively so in Europe in comparison with other parts of the world. What would be the reason? I mean, United States, it's a large economy, open economy, solid economy. So inflation, United States, is supposed to be faring better, but somehow it is highest in the United States. Why is that?
Yes, thank you for that good question. Indeed, as you noticed from my presentation, in most Asian economies, we don't have such big inflation pressures. And even in an economy with a relatively elevated inflation like South Korea, it's not like in the US. Why is that? It's very simple. And I like your reference to Economics 101. It's all a question of demand and supply. Everything in economics is about demand and supply, right? The US economy is in a very tight situation in the sense that there are still people in the US labor market who have not returned after all the COVID withdrawal. So there is still many complex reasons why people haven't returned. But so labor supply is down. There are some other supply side issues still at play, even though on the demand side, the US, as you know, people love to spend and people love to demand. On top of that, the government has been very generous. A quite misplaced, very expansive fiscal package was unleashed in 2021, which added fire to the fuel. So if you look at the US economy now, extremely tight labor market, unemployment is at a record low, and that is a condition in which when the economy is still also holding up quite well, firms are able to pass on price increases. It's quite fascinating in the US. If you look at the Q1 corporate results that have been published, consumer-facing companies are all talking to their investors about how they have been able to hold on to margins or even raised margins, even though their costs are rising. How is that possible? They've just been asking for higher prices. People accept that in a similar way because unemployment is so low. Workers are able to demand really solid wage increases, and it is those two factors. It has nothing to do with oil or commodities anymore. It's all about the fight within the economy about the pie, and as long as you continue to fight about that, you will have that overall inflation still being quite high. Sorry, I just want to make one small diversion to the UK. In the UK, the United Kingdom, the governor of the central bank was criticized a few days ago because he told off the British people. He said, we're all fighting about this pie. Firms are passing on the cost increases. Workers are demanding higher wages. If we all continue to do that, inflation will remain high. And then people said, you have a point, but there's no, you don't really solve the situation by telling off the public on that. It's your job to keep on increasing interest rates until demand cools down. And that is why the Fed will have to continue raising its interest rates. There is no other way around it. The economy, in a way, is too strong. And that is why inflation keeps on being very solid. And that is, I would say, the difference with Asia. You look at Japan, you look at China, you look at even a country like Indonesia. We don't have such a, overheated economy in any of these places.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I forget, I'm compelled to raise one quick question to Mr. Park, who spoke in Korean. So let me speak in Korean as well. 아마도 이 자리에 계신 여러분들 중에 오늘 저희 박준영 상무님 말씀하신 것 중에 제일 관심사는 우리 지금 경제 상황의 가장 아킬레스건이라고 할까요? 키 팩터가 반도체 경기에 지금 악화인데 뭐 재고 말씀도 했고 수출 뭐 여러 가지 말씀을 하셨는데 정말 알고 싶은 거는 언제쯤 이게 턴어라운드 될 거냐. 지금 이제 보면은 글로벌 시장 상황도 있고 특히 중국과의 관계 문제로 해서 대중국 수출이 크게 떨어진 이런 문제들이 있는데 이 어떻게 앞으로 진단을 하고 계신지 이게 사실 우리 전체 경제 흐름에 상당히 핵심적인 요소가 될 거라고 생각하는데 한 말씀 해주시면 좋겠습니다.
네, 되게 좋은 포인트를 레이즈 해주셨는데 사실 저희도 그 질문 되게 많이 받습니다. 저희가 이제 그런 채권 인베스터들하고도 인터랙션을 많이 하는데 그런 반도체, 하이닉스나 삼성전자가 언제 리바운드 할 것이냐, 언제 회복할 것이냐 그런 부분들 질문을 많이 받는데 일단 제가 프레젠테이션에도 말씀드렸듯이 2분기까지는 힘든 상황이 될 것 같아요. 지금의 지표들을 보면 지금 벌써 5월인데 아직도 재고가 상당히 높고 그리고 판매 그런 가격 자체도 아직은 많이 회복은 되지 않고 있습니다. 근데 이게 계속해서 이렇게 안 좋은 상황이 될 거냐 그렇게 보지는 않습니다. 저희가 볼 때는 올해 하반기에는 좀 회복되는 모습을 보일 것 같은데 몇 가지 이유가 있습니다. 첫 번째는 일단은 수요 측면에서 보면 이게 지금 반도체가 어려운 이유가 보면은 스마트폰도 안 팔리고요. 그다음에 다른 그런 PC, 태블릿 이런 것들이 지금 코로나 초기에 사람들이 많이 샀다가 최근에는 이제 안 사면서 수요가 주니까 반도체 수요도 같이 줄어드는 부분이 있고요. 그리고 또 사실 코로나 초기에 그런 인터넷 데이터 센터라든지 클라우드 관련한 그런 투자들이 많았습니다. 그래서 기업 고객들이 서버 디램 같은 거를 상당히 많이 샀는데 이제 그런 부분들이 되게 호실적을 견인했다가 이게 이제 그 고객사들이 재고 수준을 높여놔서 지금 안 사는 그런 부분이 있습니다. 그래서 이제 그런 부분들이 재고 조정에 시간이 걸리고 있는데 이런 부분들은 어느 정도 지금 이 바닥을 치고 나서 좀 회복될 가능성이 있습니다. 그래서 수요 측면에서 스마트폰이라든지 이런 수요도 어느 정도 돌아올 것이고, 그 다음에 그런 서버 관련한 수요도 돌아올 수 있는 부분이 있습니다. 그리고 또 하나는 지금 챗 GPT나 아니면 AI 이런 거 관련해서 실제로 그런 반도체에 대한 수요는 구조적으로는 늘어나는 수밖에 없는 그런 상황입니다. 그래서 이게 단기적으로는 좀 어려움이 있지만 이 반도체 산업을 전체적으로 봤을 때 중장기적인 아웃룩이 부정적이냐? 그럼 그렇게 보지는 않습니다. 상당히 수요가 다시 돌아올 여지가 많이 있고, 그리고 이게 시클릭하는 산업이기 때문에 또 다시 업턴으로 가면은 생각보다 기업들의 실적이 빨리 회복될 수 있는 그런 가능성도 있다고 보고 있습니다. 그리고 또 하나는 공급 측면인데요. 지금 수요 측면에 대해서 말씀을 드렸고, 공급 측면에서는 지금 일단은 주요 업체들이 마이크론이 먼저 감산을 발표했고, 그다음에 하이닉스도 그 감산을 하고 있고요. 삼성전자가 원래 안 했었는데 이제 최근에 또 감산에 대해서 공식화를 했기 때문에 이 서플라이 사이드에서도 좀 조정이 있으면서 이 수요 공급의 밸런스가 하반기에는 좀 더 나아질 수 있는 그런 환경이 조성된 것 같습니다. 그래서 지금 1분기, 2분기를 저점으로 해가지고 하반기에는 좀 반등하는 걸 저희는 예상하고 있습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 좀 희망 섞인 말씀을 해주셔서 대단히 감사드리고 그렇게 됐으면 하는 바람입니다. 시간이 지금 우리 저희 권 대표님 언제 지금 시간이 9시가 좀 지났는데 오늘 일정이 많으시다고 제가 얘기 들었는데 one or two questions more? 5분? Okay, we'll finish in 5 minutes. Okay, question? Okay, 네.
예, 5분 정도 남았으니까 좀 질문 하나 좀 하고 싶습니다. 하나는 그 루이스에 대한 질문인데요. 그 오늘 발표 과정에서 이제 아트 지역이라든지 한국이라든지 이런 거는 전반적으로 문제가 없는데 저희들이 한국이 걱정하는 게 이제 미국발 이제 금융 위기 가능성을 걱정하거든요. 왜냐하면은 지금 말씀하신 것처럼 계속 금리는 이제 올라갈 가능성이 있고 그러다가 보면은 이제 실리콘밸리 은행이라든지 미국의 어떤 지방 은행들의 부도 가능성이 있고 이게 이제 미국에만 끝나지 않고 유럽으로 전이되거나 아시아에 영향을 줄 이런 어떤 금융 위기 가능성을 어느 정도 보는지 좀 한번 질문드리고 싶고요. 또 우리 박 이사님은 이제 저 가장 듣고 싶은 게 사장이었는데 그 사장은 빼고 오늘 발표를 이렇게 마치셨는데 한국이 굉장히 관심 있는 게 이제 지오폴리티컬 리스크거든요. 왜냐하면은 중국으로부터는 급격히 빼면서 미국으로는 지금 굉장히 적극적으로 투자를 하는데 이 분절적인 면에서 소위 구조적 마찰이 지금 한국에서는 겪고 있는 거거든요. 그러다 보니까 중국으로부터는 수출이 빠지고 또 아세안으로서도 빠지고 또 그 대신 이제 미국으로부터는 많이 늘어나지 않는 이런 어떤 그 구조적 전환기 속에서의 그 어려움을 한국이 겪고 있는데 이 부분은 이제 박 이사님이 보시기에 어떻게 보시는지, 이게 또 앞으로 한국 경제에는 어떤 영향을 미칠 것인지를 좀 한번 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
네, 좋은 질문 감사합니다. Please, Louis.
Thank you also for the good question about the possibility, about the risk that some of the financial turbulence in the US will spill over onto the APEC region and economies like South Korea, either via the financial system or via the economy. There's definitely a risk of that, and today the news in the newspaper this morning was not very good overnight in terms of how some of the stress in the US banking system is spreading to more banks and other parts in addition to where the stress was initially. We continue to think that the risk that this financial turbulence will have a significant systemic impact in economies in APEC is still relatively modest. Why do I say that? First, within the US, the authorities and most people looking at this market feel that look, we don't know. There can be many more days or even weeks when this turbulence will continue to affect more banks. But we do know that the Fed and other regulators in the US have quite a bit of firepower to very quickly inject liquidity. They arrange takeovers. So there are quite a few instruments that are being used to dampen this stress within the US. We've also seen that it doesn't seem to affect the economic sentiment very much. If we look at our S&P global PMI indices, I mentioned they are quite nice barometers for how do business people in the manufacturing sector, in the service sector, look at their economic future. We don't really see a lot of stress building up. I think people are reading the newspaper, they are aware of what's happening, but they feel it's not really affecting our business very much or my personal life. And as long as that continues to be the case, then the economic growth will not be affected too much. And that is super important because if you, and this is the finding of our experts here in Asia, which I'm not, the people who are looking at the financial sector, they say the average Korean institution, their exposure to these vulnerable parts of the US financial sector is not all that big directly. It could become an impact if there is contagion via the financial sector or if there is spillover via the economic channels. And these latter two channels, the overall financial impact onto this region and the economic impact so far seem to be relatively contained. So it's much too early to say no, and we really would not want to see the US debt ceiling discussion start to interact with this financial turbulence, but I would say so far it doesn't look like this is becoming part of our baseline scenario.
Thank you. Thank you. Geopolitical risk.
그 지정학적인 이슈 지오폴리틱스가 또 저희가 되게 질문 많이 받는 분야 중에 하나인데 이게 뭐 워낙 복잡한 이슈지만 제가 짧게만 요약을 해보겠습니다. 일단 한국 기업들이 이제 이런 이슈에 리스크로 노출이 된 상황도 있고 또 아니면 이게 기회 요인도 되기도 합니다. 그래서 리스크 쪽을 먼저 말씀을 드리면 이제 대표적으로는 반도체를 말씀드릴 수 있겠고요. 반도체 같은 경우에는 지금 삼성이나 하이닉스가 중국의 생산 비중이 상당히 높은 상황입니다. 그래서 일단은 그리고 중국 시장 자체도 디맨드도 크고요. 그래서 중국에서 생산을 갑자기 중단하기는 어려운 상황이고, 근데 이제 미국에서 이런 반도체 장비의 수출, 중국으로 수입하는 거에 이제 리스트릭션이 있어서 이제 그런 부분들은 지금은 좀 유예를 받았지만 이 부분은 계속해서 이슈가 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 저희가 보기에는 그 부분은 당연히 이제 리스크 요인이고요. 그리고 그런 기업의 실적에는 부담 요인이 될 수 있는데 이 부분이 이제 그 투자 측면에서 보면은 한국이라든지 미국으로 투자를 늘리면서 중국의 익스포저를 점차적으로 줄여나가는 형태로 갈 것 같습니다. 근데 사실 워낙 그 비중이 크기 때문에 뭐 이게 단기간 내에 중국에서 이렇게 나오거나 하기는 쉽지 않은 부분입니다. 그리고 또 중국 관련해서 하나 더 말씀드리고 싶은 거는 이 한국 기업들 지금 대표 기업들의 중국의 그런 시장 점유율이나 마켓 프레젠스를 보면은 이미 많이 약해진 부분이 많습니다. 그래서 현대차도 과거에는 중국에서 뭐 시장 점유율 10% 이렇게 가져가던 시기가 있었는데 지금은 1% 아래로 내려왔고요. 거의 뭐 차를 많이 못 팔고 있는 상황이죠. 삼성도 스마트폰을 과거에는 중국에서 많이 팔았지만 지금은 거의 못 팔고 있고요. LG전자 가전도 중국에서는 거의 사업을 하지 않고 있습니다. 그래서 한국 기업들이 중국 시장이 워낙 그 컴페티티브하기 때문에 이미 익스포저를 많이 줄여놔서 반도체를 제외하면 다른 산업들이 다이렉트 익스포저가 그렇게 크다고 볼 필요까지는 없을 것 같습니다. 그래서 이제 그런 부분들을 말씀을 드리고 싶고, 그 다음에 이제 조금 긍정적인 측면에서 기회 요인으로는 그 요즘 뭐 EV가 가장 좀 핫한 그런 분야고, EV 배터리가 한국 기업들이 이 지금 중국의 뭐 CATL과 함께 이 세계 시장을 선도하고 있는데요. 특히 EV 배터리 시장이 이제 빠르게 열리는데 가장 성장 가능성이 높은 시장이 북미, 미국 시장입니다. 근데 중국 업체들은 사실 미국에 직접 진출하기 어려운 상황이니까 미중 관계로 인해서, 그래서 사실은 미국의 지금 배터리 생산을 한국 업체가 거의 주도하고 있다, 도미네이트하고 있다라고 볼 수 있고요. 그래서 그런 글로벌, 심지어 뭐 일본 회사 혼다도 지금 LG랑 그 LG 에너지 솔루션이랑 조인트 벤처를 맺었고, 뭐 미국 기업들, 한국 기업 다 이렇게 한국의 그 배터리 메이커들하고 하고 있는데 이 시장 자체가 가장 성장 가능성도 크고 여러 가지 사업 기회를 제공할 수 있는 부분이라서 물론 중국에서 어려움을 겪는 부분도 있지만 또 다른 한국 기업들은 미국에서 상당히 큰 성장 기회를 가지고 있다. 다만 이게 투자가 워낙 공격적으로 진행되기 때문에 재무적으로는 좀 부담이 되는 회사도 있을 수 있고, 그거는 회사의 이제 재무 정책에 따라서 신용도 측면에서는 긍정적일 수도 있고 부정적일 수도 있고, 그거는 회사마다 조금 다를 것 같습니다.
네, 대단히 감사합니다. 시간이 되었기 때문에 it's time to close. I would like to thank all the speakers from S&P today. On behalf of our audience, I appreciate their insightful views and stimulating discussions throughout this breakfast forum this morning. And I would like to also thank our audience for your joining us this morning for very first breakfast forum in 3 years, organized by IGE. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you, S&P.